And I came out of it being like, okay, I'm not craving more. I like that was 12 hours. I'm good.
Right.
But I also found myself not craving any other substances. And I remember thinking, like, that is very weird. I was not expecting that to be the outcome of this. It's not why I went into this.
Hmm.
And at least not directly. And then when I did more research, I found out that Bill W., who's the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, actually came up with the idea of Alcoholics Anonymous in an LSD induced trip.
Well, would
And
would you look at that?
would you look at that?
That's
And
incredible.
and after the founding of AA, continued to do LSD therapy and tried to fold psychedelic therapy back into Alcoholics Anonymous. But at that point, the people had already said, "No, Bill, you've told us no mind altering substances. What the fuck are you saying with this shit?"
Right.
And these are people who again were so desperate to cure their addiction that that seemed like a threat to them. And especially then with like then you hear about with in the 60s with all this like reckless use of LSD and people committing suicide and the scare and everything. So anyways, it never got folded back in. But when I
Right.
learned about that, I was like, wait, okay, maybe there's something here. Let me continue to dig into this. If the founder of AA continued to use LSD, then I don't feel as bad about exploring
Yeah.
with psychedelics
and
myself.
and there's so much like content there as far as like the birth of that whole psychedelic period. I mean, there is the huge conflict around like MDMA therapy for alcoholism, about how like they
Hmm.
essentially proved that it was the best possible therapy for
Hmm.
that particular kind of addiction, and it was completely ixnayed because of the way that it was presented culturally. And so it's like we are
Yes.
missing out on so I often lament like the healing that could have taken place if it weren't for like the things that stopped the development of so many different drugs during the
Oh
20th
yeah.
century.
My housemate and I were just talking about like how different the trajectory of psychedelic therapy would have looked like if imagine if Bill W had actually folded in
Yeah,
psychedelic therapy into AA and that was the introduction culturally to psychedelics was in the context of therapy as
there's
opposed
so
to in
many
this context.
small
Hmm.
decisions that could have changed that, like, or even looking at like even looking at weed. And this is not necessarily like a small decision, but it's just like if there had not been that initial association of like reefer and reefer madness with like black people and
Right.
crime in general, like
Right.
if it had simply been introduced to the culture in a different way, it's like we wouldn't
Absolutely.
be, first of all, we wouldn't be paying $200 an ounce, and second of all, like the infrastructure for it would be so much more supportive. It would be a crop that like when I think about weed in particular, it's like it would be a crop that would have changed the structure of like human life going forward.
Yes.
And then these other psychedelics would have changed the structure of the human mind. And so it's like there's
Oh,
all
and
these things that got in the way of it.
I mean, you even think about the way in which, again, this is all stuff that came from my roommate more than me, but um, if you think about like Roe v. Wade and the constant struggle with abortion right now, where part of the resistance and why that's this ongoing battle, at least his theory is that um, it was introduced at this federal level, and it was like imposed on all of these states
Right.
without giving the states an opportunity to sort of like test these things out individually, and it created the situation where people like resist it and have this backlash to
Of course.
abortion, almost like not for any reason other than that they're just mad that things are being imposed on them, as opposed to like
Right.
what we're seeing with a lot of now, with medical marijuana and eventually recreational marijuana, where it's like
Hmm.
being tested in smaller states that are more open to it to the point where by the time it was like, well, I mean, I guess we're still not there where it's totally legalized,
Right.
but it's less of this issue. But like, imagine if, they had gone about abortion a different way. We wouldn't still be here arguing about all of that shit. So,
Exactly. And yeah, and there's no place where like it's more apparent than, yeah, with the use of like psychedelic drugs. And there was
mhm.
this like malicious, almost malicious agenda. Like when you go back and look at it, I like did all of this there was a time when I thought I was going to go into like drug research as my thing, and then I figured out that I was no good at math or science, and so it was like the only way I can involve myself in drugs is in a creative, right-brained sort of
Sure.
way. But it's like you look back and you see all of the different opportunity, like when each of these drugs were created, there were so many different opportunities and explorations that were made that got cut off like
Hmm.
at the very inception of it. It's like you have to, like, you look at then how drugs played out, like if the war on drugs hadn't happened, like how would everything look? Like, it is such an immense um cultural influence that it's had just by like
Hmm.
removing them from it. I'm not sure exactly what I'm getting at with this point, but it's like I am so fascinated to see where psychedelic therapy and everything heads in the future. Are you able to talk a little bit? I know I cannot remember the name of it, but you posted on Twitter about a psychedelic therapy program that you had been looking into. I briefly
Mind
visited
bloom.
Mind Bloom. I briefly visited the website. Would you be willing to elaborate a little more on that? Because I'm fascinated by it.
Yeah, so Mind Bloom is a ketamine therapy program that I believe they're based in New York. They operate during COVID. Right now, they've been forced to move to everything remotely, and they're in
Right.
a couple of states. They're in like Florida, California, New York,
I
and
know it's
a handful of
definitely
others.
limited access because I put in
Yeah,
like my state and info, and it's like we'll be there soon.
yeah, it's limited access for sure, and I mean, it's like, after you have your consultation, they quite literally, I mean, where where is it right here? They'll quite literally like mail you some ketamine.
That's
And
incredible. By the way, Mind Bloom, reach out. I will do ads. Sponsor me in some way. Send a sample box, whatever you can do.
it's wild. And I mean, everything is very closely monitored.
Hmm.
You work with your integration coach. And I mean, the dose that they put you on is like with the intention of a K-hole. It's not this like my experience with ketamine prior had been like, you take a couple bumps at the club and you're floating around. This
And
is like forget
ketamine
about your
is
body.
ketamine is one that I personally do not have a huge amount of experience with it. So feel free to like lay it out in total layman's terms. It so a K-hole is due to large amounts of consumption and is basically just like a fugue state of some kind within the
Some
trip.
something like that. So I mean, it's an anesthetic. Usually, it's known as horse tranquilizer, and it's a
Yes.
dissociative. And so it's like a numbing dissociative anesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, what happens at a certain point is you just like forget about your body, and people describe it as this out of body experience, so in a different way as other psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
And when coupled with something like music or meditation, or intention setting,
Yes.
um, you know you can have these like quite visual trips, where you're like looking at parts of yourself. And what I really enjoy about ketamine is that because you're sort of like numbed and standing outside of yourself, you're kind of looking at yourself from this like total non-judgment place where you're
Right.
just looking at facts, and you're able to like observe yourself and see how you act in certain situations. And then, when you come out of it, you're able to take some time to continue to reflect and journal and write about your experiences, and ultimately like working with an integration coach on folding these learnings back into your everyday life.
Right, which is that's a huge part of it because I think when people talk a lot about like recreational versus like therapeutic use of psychedelics and stuff, people who maybe do not believe in or support the therapeutic aspects of it are very much like, well, you're just taking drugs and having a good time, and then you don't learn anything from it. But the
Hmm.
key is like being able to go back to reflect and try and integrate, yeah, those experiences into real life. So Mind Bloom is providing the structure for that. That's so cool.
Yeah, and they very heavily emphasize things like ritual. And I
Yes.
mean, it's still like, who knows, like we don't know if like, is the Mind Bloom program the thing that works about it? Is it just that they're providing structure that works about it? We don't know. It's still
Yeah.
very early on, but I'm fascinated by it. I'm actually also sort of looking into possibly like entering that field of work as well too, just because I
I
think
think
that
that's
there's a
incredible.
lot of opportunity. But
It's, I mean, it's a
did,
hugely growing field for sure.
oops.
Oh!
And I mean, there goes my microphone. Um, but I mean, what where I see the benefits is, I mean, seeing what it did for what it's has been and continues to do for my addiction. Um, I think there's really a lot of opportunity there for like positive change in people who need it. And I think that a lot of the it's hard when so many people's experience of people who use psychedelics is in this like white dread, like, patchouli, peace and
Well,
love, like,
mine here, like, if I think a really great case study in that is like Colorado and the vibe around psychedelics in Colorado, because there's a huge culture of it, and a
mm-hmm,
huge chunk of that culture is like 100% concert based and like patterned clothing like based. So there is a there it's I wouldn't even go so far as to call it a stigma, but it's like there is a vibe to the kind
mm-hmm.
of person that uses psychedelic drugs and what they are using them for.
Exactly, and I'm not here to judge anybody's experience of the drug.
Right.
Like they're very well maybe having these like incredible experiences of it. However, I think there's a lot culturally that is tied up with this sort of like countercultural resistance that, as opposed to, I think there's something interesting about coming into my use of psychedelics in a period where it's like, no, I'm coming into it in the context of something therapeutic,
Right.
which
Because
is
it
just a different introduction to it.
Yeah, because I think I the word counterculture is important because I think a lot of people who have not had any experience with psychedelics consider the use of it to be counter to the culture. Like those who use it and the
Right.
experiences that are had using psychedelics are di- um, are separate from or detract from like society as a whole and the structure of society, and that it will somehow affect that or change it when it's like they're actually are ways that they can be used and experiences that can be had that improve the way we function as a society.
Or that it even is a, yeah, exactly. Or that it even is a culture in and of itself, right? Like
Right.
that's like where the definite, like the line stops at like, well, it is drug culture. Well, it's like, actually, I mean, if you think about like alcohol, like there are people from tons of
Well,
different walks of life who consume alcohol in different ways.
if there's
And
anything
that,
I've learned in my 20s, that's a culture. Like drinking
well,
culture is its own like I mean, yeah, you can apply that to just about any drug. Of course there's
totally.
going to be a stigma and a culture that arises around it.
All right. And much like how in the queer community, it's like we know like there are so many, like we are not just all one lump gay, it's
Thank
there's lots of
God.
flavors with, yeah, thank God. Um and I mean it's the same with drug use where it's, or as we're exploring the use of psychedelics, I really want to be deliberate about like it's not that I am against certain types of people, but it's like people are going into it for very different reasons, and it's important to
Yes.
parse those out.
Yes.
Um,
Because there's just a lot of potential for hurt and misunderstanding when it comes to those things because drugs are so wrapped up in so many like cultural and emotional experiences. So many people have their own experiences with addiction and drug use and family and all of those things that
the
color
pain of
their
seeing
view.
someone struggle with addiction, like of course,
Yes.
like, or yeah, exactly.
Which is why like
Or
I have my own particular like subjective and many negative views about like alcohol because I have seen that played out in so
Mhm,
many different awful negative iterations. And it's like, and if anybody is listening to this that has apprehensions or fears or holdbacks about psychedelic drugs or any other thing that falls under that drug spectrum, it's like I would love to illustrate the point to everybody in the world that it's like you grow up with the context of like drug and substance abuse that you see
mhm,
around you, and it's like,
mhm,
and I for example watched my parents like really responsibly and in kind of a lovely way like use weed throughout my childhood, which kind
mhm,
of brought me to the understanding of it that I have now as a therapeutic and a useful tool. And sure, I'm changing my relationship with it as we speak, but it's like I also in that upbringing came to see so many bad things happen to people because of alcohol, and
mhm,
but didn't have an understanding of how psychedelics could ever have that negative. Or
mhm.
I of course you hear horror stories, but it's like I never got that same negative understanding of psychedelics, and so there's just plethora of experience with it, and I don't think that it should ever be used to like make a judgment of somebody's character, and it so often is.
Yeah. Yeah, it so often is. It really.
Everybody has an image of a cocaine user, a drinker, a psychedelics user, and a weed smoker in their brain. Like that, everybody has an archetype ready to go.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean,